This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The Long, Deep Grudge, a story of big capital, radical labor, and class war in the American heartland by Tony Gilpin. This rich history details the bitter, deep-rooted conflict between industrial behemoth International Harvester and the radical Farm Equipment Workers Union. The Long, Deep Grudge makes clear that class warfare has been and remains integral to the American experience, providing up-close and personal and long-view perspectives from both sides of the battle lines. Both Harvester and the FE are now gone, but this largely forgotten clash helps explain the crisis of yawning inequality now facing U.S. workers, and provides alternative models from the past that can instruct and inspire those engaged in radical working class struggles today. John Sayles says of the book, "A capitalist family dynasty, a radical union, and a revolution in how and where work gets done." Tony Gilpin's The Long, Deep Grudge is a detailed chronicle of one of the most active battlefronts in our ever-evolving class war. The Long, Deep Grudge, a story of big capital, radical labor, and class war in the American heartland, by Tony Gilpin, out now from Haymarket Books. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. When we think of the 20th century's big and horrible events, World War I, World War II and the Holocaust, the Cold War and its nightmarish Third World proxy fights, we think of statesmen and business interests and battlefields and covert ops. We look at major ideological systems like liberalism, communism, and fascism. But we seldom consider religion, and that's a mistake. Capitalist modernity never disenchanted the West, despite the West's rationalist pretensions to the contrary. Indeed, one of capitalist modernity's core contradictions is that it constantly reenchants the world in new and sometimes very disturbing and violent ways. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, there was no more powerful religious institution than the Catholic Church, and it was a powerful force for right-wing reaction. That's what I'm discussing today with Giuliana Chamedes, the author of the remarkable book, A 20th Century Crusade, The Vatican's Battle to Remake Christian Europe. Chamedes tells the story of the Catholic Church's long-running war against liberalism and socialism, and how it began to morph into an all-out war on communism during World War I. The menace of godless communism became an overriding cause, and it led the Catholic Church into grotesque alliances with fascist governments in Italy, Spain, and Germany. 3 Italian men are key to this story of Vatican anti-communism between 1914 and 1958, and all of them, remarkably, ultimately ruled as Pope. Remembering their names will help guide you through this interview. First, there's Benedict XV, who was Pope from 1914 to 1922. Then Achille Ratti, who became Pope Pius XI from 1922 to 1939, but who first served as one of Benedict XV's top diplomats. And finally, Eugenio Pacelli, who was Pope Pius XII from 1939 to 1958, and who also served as another one of Benedict's top diplomats. Together, the 3 forged the Vatican crusade against communism. The Vatican ultimately embraced a third-way politics incredibly similar in many ways to that put forward by fascists. It's no surprise, then, that Pius XII ultimately focused on protecting what he saw as Catholic interests and did close to nothing as Hitler embarked on his campaign to murder Europe's Jews. Before we get started, this podcast is overwhelmingly a listener-supported podcast, and I would love it if you joined your fellow listeners in supporting us at patreon.com/thedig. We also have left-wing books to send you in the mail if you contribute at least $10 a month. I go to the post office every few weeks to send them out. It's a beautiful thing. I do not get those stamps.com commercials on so many podcasts hating on going to the post office. I love going to the post office. Anyways, one of those books is Capital City, Gentrification and the Real Estate State by Samuel Stein. If you haven't done so yet, please support us at patreon.com/thedig. That's patreon.com/thedig. Also, some event announcements. The Dig is going to Massachusetts for Bernie 2020 this Saturday, February 22nd at 7 p.m. I'll be interviewing Jacobins Bhaskar Sunkara and Alex Press for a live show at Harvard's Yenching Auditorium. That's in Cambridge, Massachusetts, this Saturday, February 22nd at 7 p.m. I will include a link to that event in the show notes. Also, I have a bunch of upcoming events for my book, All-American Nativism, How the Bipartisan War on Immigrants Explains Politics as We Know It. Coming up really soon, Philadelphia at the Wooden Shoe on February 24th with Carly Goodman. And then Mount Ephraim, New Jersey on the 25th at Gallery 88. And then on February 26th in D.C. at Solid State Books in conversation with Dara Lind. And then again on February 27th at Metro D.C. DSA's Socialist Night School. And then February 28th, Baltimore at Red Emma's in conversation with Christy Thornton. Wednesday, March 4th, I'll be at Trident Books in Boston at 7 p.m. speaking with Stephanie DeGoyer. And then I'm off to New Orleans and a bunch of places in Texas, Houston, McAllen, San Antonio, Dallas, and Austin between March 11th and March 20th. Okay, here's Giuliana Chamedes, professor of European International History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the author of A 20th Century Crusade, The Vatican's Battle to Remake Christian Europe. She is also one of the founders of Our Wisconsin Revolution, the Wisconsin-based branch of Our Revolution, which, of course, was born right after Bernie Sanders' 2016 run for the presidency. Giuliana Chamedes, welcome to The Dig.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Before we get into a lot of specific complex history, I want to ask about your book's general argument. You write that for a long time, 20th century history has been understood as characterized by the rise of secularism and the decline of religion. But you say that this is wrong, that in fact religion in general and the Catholic Church in particular were key throughout, particularly in Europe, and most importantly as a force of right-wing reaction. What is the conventional perspective? What does it get wrong? And why does it get things wrong in the way that it does?
Fantastic. Thank you for starting on this important point. So the conventional perspective, I would say, which has been inherited from the 20th and even the 19th century, is bound up with the idea that as societies modernize, they supposedly secularize as well, which is to say their commitments to religion fall away. They grow increasingly committed to the separation of church and state. And you see a retreat of religion from the public to the private sphere. That has been accompanied by another narrative which holds that gradually religion might even slip away, the more modern and industrialized societies become. And this was a story that you find in all kinds of philosophical and social scientific tracks. And it has an enduring hold on academics and I would say on the popular consciousness as well. One important thing to note, though, is that while religion is seen as a force that has not played a significant role in recent U.S. and European history, plenty of pundits and scholars are willing to carve out major spaces for religion in non-Western societies. So part of what my book...
These timeless places without history.
Precisely. So exactly part of what my book was trying to do, and I would say one of its early driving impulses was to investigate the extent to which that widely repeated claim is correct. And it was, the book was written essentially in the immediate aftermath of the war in Iraq and very much shaped by that particular moment in world history and all of the hysteria that accompanied that moment about Islamophobia or, the place of Islam in politics and so forth. And so I began really simply with the question of whether it is the case that, as you say, these places without history are the ones distinctly subject to some sort of pre-modern theocratic onslaught, or whether the story is more complicated. And what I found, and I went in very much with an open mind, I will say, what I found shocked me in the sense that I took a trip a little bit on a fluke to the secret Vatican archives in Rome.
As one does.
Totally. Waved hello to the Swiss guards in their beautiful outfits. And as I got into the archival materials, it really hit me on the head that it's not just that religion has played a role in the story of Europe's history since in the last 100, 120 years even just. It's that religion has played a major role in shaping European politics, European culture, in helping consolidate a very long-lasting ideology, which is to say the ideology of anti-communism. And so suddenly, what became really a sort of side question for me when I had first headed into these archives became the real story. And I decided that I wanted to tell that story.
It's interesting because the Vatican has always seen itself as a major power, but ironically, because of a Eurocentric worldview, a view that the Vatican has often very much embraced, because of that Eurocentric worldview, the Vatican's status as a power has been invisible to many in the West.
I think that's absolutely the case, yes. Curiously enough, the Vatican itself was a leading perpetuator of this Eurocentrism. And, my book is entitled A 20th Century Crusade, The Vatican's Battle to Remake Christian Europe, because the Vatican was interested in reshaping Europe and the European continent in its image as a launching ground for what it imagined would be a global recapture of political and cultural affairs. It was very much the case that the key Vatican officials who were captaining this strategy were not only Europeans, but predominantly Italians. And they were completely convinced that their cultural imperialist project needed to begin in Europe precisely because Europe was, on their view, the site for civilization, the space of progress, the space of modernity. And so that's another key sense in which my book really undermines some of the common assumptions out there about Catholic and papal traditionalism in the sense that these figures cast themselves and understood themselves as ultramodern. They weren't reactions to modernity. They were using modernity, using new media, using new tools like international law to their own ends in the 20th century. And so, in that sense, too, the classic modernization, secularization story needs to be turned on its head, in that it's not modernity that erases religion. It's actually a series of innovations that we associate with first wave globalization that, in fact, enable a resurgence on the part of various religious organizations and groups.
Let's go to the history, and where you start is World War I. And in 1917, Pope Benedict XV named a priest named Eugenio Pacelli, who himself would later become Pope Pius XII in 1939. He named Pacelli papal ambassador to Bavaria, this heavily Catholic region of Germany, at the height of World War I. And Pacelli saw a dark conspiracy behind the U.S.'s entry into the war, a plan to, quote, Americanize the whole world, making it Freemason so as to liberate it from its servitude to the Kaiser, the Pope, and the priesthood. And you write, quote, to our modern day ears, promising to make the world safe for democracy might sound like innocent sloganeering. But to Eugenio Pacelli, papal officials, and Catholic conservatives, Woodrow Wilson's phrase signaled that the American president was raising a revolutionary flag. Pius XI, who succeeded Benedict, saw Wilsonian liberal democracy as a threat to true peace, which he believed that only kings and kingdoms could bring about. His first encyclical stated that it was only people in, quote, the Middle Ages in possession of that true League of Nations, and it was called, quote, Christianity. Why did the church see World War I the way that it did? And how was that vision shaped by this long-running and deep Vatican hostility to liberalism?
So the Pope's hostility to liberalism and to popular sovereignty really gets jump-started by the French Revolution in the late 18th century. Over the course of the 19th century, you have a veritable industry of counter-revolutionary texts that are being churned out to defend the idea that popular sovereignty and democracy are directly at odds with Catholicism, with core Catholic beliefs, and with the expansion and protection of Catholic privileges, specifically, again, in European society. World War I is the culmination of many of these trends for various reasons. The Vatican enters the scene in World War I, when World War I kicks off in 1914, as an extremely beleaguered power. It's probably at its weakest point in modern history. The papal states that it had occupied for centuries have been stripped away in the course of Italy's wars of unification.
And this was a literal temporal kingdom in central Italy with millions of subjects. It wasn't just the Pope as the head of the universal church, but the Pope as the king of an actual kingdom.
Correct. The Pope as temporal sovereign. So the papal states have been stripped away. The papacy declares itself a prisoner of the Vatican in order to elicit some sort of international response to Italy's actions. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, you have numerous countries in Europe that pass laws that are attempting to weaken the church's traditional power over domains like education, civil society, marriage and divorce law, etc. So the church sees itself as extremely under threat. It also has been pretty unsuccessful in preserving its status as a, let's say, great power among the great powers, it tries to show up at various international conferences, and only rarely does it succeed in getting a seat at the table. And in World War I itself, the Vatican was looking forward to having a seat at the peace conference that draws the war to a close, the Paris Peace Conference of 1819. And instead, what ends up being the case is that the Vatican is barred from the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 as well, because of a secret clause in a treaty that Italy had signed in 1915 as a condition for Italy essentially switching sides and joining World War I with its historic enemies. Italy says, we'll join you on several conditions, one of which being do not invite the Pope or his diplomats to whatever peace conference comes out of this conflict, because we don't want a revision of those boundaries, right? They were not interested in ceding back the papal states that had been taken from the Pope. So the Pope and papal diplomats around him see themselves in a very, very precarious position. And in addition to the rise of liberalism that is manifest on continental Europe in the 19th and early 20th century, there's also another movement that's really concerning to the Pope, and that is, of course, socialism. Socialism is also identified and seen as an anti-clerical movement, and the Pope is extremely worried that a coalition of liberals and socialists will settle a new world order that writes the Vatican and the Catholic Church out of the equation. That's the big fear. The entry of the United States into World War I in April of 1917 really heightens this concern that a power that is seen as the archetypal liberal democratic power, that is seen as the archetypal capitalist power. This is another theme that I'm sure we'll get to. The papacy was not a fan of capitalism, not because it was socialist, but it was in favor of a third solution, a third way solution that was neither, free market capitalist nor socialist. The fact that the United States is so strongly identified with capitalism and has really emerged as a major economic player by this point, even before the U.S. officially joins World War I with its men, it is bankrolling the effort, and so much so that, European countries end up greatly indebted to the United States after World War I, and that whole sick structure of debt shapes very much the interwar years in various ways. But anyway, it's as a result of this feeling of extreme weakness that the Vatican decides to change its tactics and essentially stop the policy of simply issuing remonstrations and criticisms of liberal, capitalist, and socialist precepts, and instead go on the offensive. And that's where the story gets really interesting, because the Vatican decides, first tentatively and then in a way that basically develops a momentum of its own and has its own path dependency, it decides to make use of new media in absolutely revolutionary ways. It decides to hugely grow its presence in civil society precisely in the era of expanding popular sovereignties. Even though it maintains a fundamental anti-democratic commitment, it still understands the importance of the people, quote unquote, and it makes use of international legal treaties recognized under international law in order to carve out what is essentially, I argue, a peace settlement before the official peace settlement is made, as it sees that the empires with which it had its sympathies, which is to say the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire, are not going to win this war. it basically moves to create an alternative peace settlement of its own, and an alternative peace settlement that's entirely animated by the fear of a liberal or socialist new order taking shape, which for the Vatican means an order that writes the church out of the public sphere as a preface to writing the church out of existence.
Yes, so the Catholic Church had lost its own earthly theocracy at the same time that European states were becoming less theocratically enthralled to the church. And you write that the church responds by this first by performing the trappings of a nation state, creating this massive legal set of legal documents called the Code of Canon Law that they start drafting in 1904 and complete in 1917. And then they move onto the international stage and try to insert that canon law into the laws of other nation states across Europe through these treaties called concordants.
Yes, it's a really, really fascinating attempt to use the letter of the law to serve what are essentially theocratic aims. So the Code of Canon Law
to make the Vatican more state-like and make states more Catholic and thus more subject to the Vatican.
Yes. And this is an interesting turn as well, in the sense that over the 19th century, the Vatican had actually really strongly criticized the nation state as a political form and was very concerned about its existence. It preferred imperial forms of rule. World War I represents a really key turning point for the Vatican, because it's with World War I, and specifically with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is concluded in March of 1918, that the Vatican decides to embrace the state form and, in fact, self-consciously help in nation and state building projects that are absolutely essential to a whole series of Eastern and Central European countries that are either newly constituted as a result of this treaty and as a result of World War I, or they're newly reconstituted. Their borders are radically redrawn. And I think you're right that part of that shift is enabled by the fact that the Vatican itself, in a situation where it is desperately trying to bolster its own power and restore the territorial sovereignty that it lost, it starts self-consciously fashioning itself as a new sort of state. And in this, it is actually the most innovative of states, because it is a state that already has transnational presence and the possibility to sway individuals really all over the world through what we might call soft power, and through also what we might call identity politics. So, so this is another funny realization that I had along the way. This power that we really do tend to think of as, the most backwards power, a monarchy in the age of democracy, committed to all sorts of norms within family life and gender relations that feel anathema to our present day. This power is at the same time a pioneer of a new form of internationalism that is grounded in a state or state-like presence, but that sees as its mission moving beyond its own borders and creating transnational communities of belonging that can be mobilized for political ends, for religious ends, for cultural ends.
Yeah, I want to talk more about the relationship between nationalism and universalism, but first I want to talk more about national self-determination and nationalism in particular, because of course this was a huge thing throughout the era. There was the communist variant put forward by Lenin, which was anti-colonial. There was a Wilsonian version, which was very much colonialist, which I've discussed recently on the show with Adam Getachew and Noura Erakat. But what you write about is this model for self-determination from this period that I was not familiar with, which was shared by both the Vatican and I think Germany too, and which was very specifically focused on East Central Europe. These parts of the Russian Empire cleaved off as independent nation states thanks to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty of 1918, which was signed amid World War I after the Bolshevik Revolution. What did the Vatican and Germany find to be so important about that region, and how did their vision of national self-determination differ from these two better-known variants, the Leninist and the Wilsonian ones?
As you said, national self-determination emerges as a sort of norm in this period, but it really means very different things depending on who is talking the national self-determination talk. As far as I know, it's fairly uncontroversial that Lenin is the first well-known figure who articulates a commitment to national self-determination. But for him, national self-determination is not only anti-imperialist, as you said, that's absolutely right, but it's also a stepping stone to the ultimate abolition of the nation state and the creation of a global communist society. So it's simply an instrumental phase that will help achieve the breaking apart of empires. And from there can be the next stage akin to the one that Marx laid out, that is a post-statist vision for how human beings can get together and create a more just society. Interestingly, the first person to respond in a public forum and get some traction to Lenin is not Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is the one who we think about today, right? He was able to famously associate himself with this term through, by the way, an elaborate PR campaign as well. But in fact, it was the Pope before Wilson in August of 1917 who starts singing the National Self-Determination Song. And this was quite striking and surprising, not least because, of course, on most other things, Lenin and the Pope would not even have used the same words, but also because the Pope, again, is indicating with this a new willingness to embrace the nation state as a political form and, in fact, help advance projects of nation and state building. Now, when the Pope embraces national self-determination, he is in conversation with key figures in the German Empire who are very much thinking in new ways in their own right. This is a moment in the war when there's a split within the rulers of the German Empire over exactly whether it is worth it to try to hold on to the traditional conception of German imperial power or whether it's time to think about imperialism in a new way. And a key figure who is advocating the latter position, that is, let's stay imperialist, but think about imperialism in a new way, is a politician in the Catholic Center Party who argues for what he calls control without territorial control. And what he's really after here is a form of cultural and economic hegemony that will enable Germany to maintain a presence in those parts of Eastern Europe that it had always wanted in its orbit without actually having to go through the hassle of militarily controlling those lands.
It reminds me of indirect rule, but maybe on second thought, even more so like neocolonialism.
Yes, I agree. Neocolonialism also because the vision from the get-go is both about economic control over resources and creating preferential market structures, and animated by a notion that Germany is, after all, more civilized than these other parts of Europe, and that gives Germany a right to exercise this cultural hegemony as well. So in both of those senses, I think you're absolutely hitting the nail on the head there, that it's a form of neocolonialism. Ante litteram, long before anybody would really use that phrase in the way that we do today. So papal diplomats are very inspired by this German vision, which gets enshrined in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is this absolutely central moment in European and world history that I think has been lost a little bit just because there's so much else going on, right? We've just had the Russian Revolution, World War I is drawing to a close, etc. But this treaty is one in which the Germans are, in one sense, propping up the legitimacy of the Bolsheviks, who nobody knew whether they would emerge victorious ultimately from the civil war that they ended up trapped in immediately. But on the other hand, the Bolsheviks, knowing that they need to deliver on the promise of getting Russia out of the war, hand over huge swaths of territory.
You write 1 million square miles off the old Russian Empire, quote, giving up Russia's control of 90% of the empire's coal mines, 54% of its industry, 33% of its rail system, and 32% of its agricultural land.
That's right. It's absolutely striking, isn't it? It's a huge handover in the service of the revolution and in the service of delivering on this key promise that the Bolsheviks had made. But what happens
to end the war?
To end the war.
To end the war,
to get Russia out of the war. With this handover, you have the formal independence given to states like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, but you also have the creation of an informal empire that Germany controls. And this idea of control without direct territorial occupation really appeals to papal diplomats who work very hard to bolster this idea within their circles in Rome and are very inspired by it as they decide to move forward with their own form of hegemonic project in the form of concordats that are signed with these new states. So Concordat is signed with Latvia in 1922, with Lithuania in 1927, with Estonia in 1920, etc.
And these are not savory leaders. Latvia is ruled by Karlis Ulmanis, this authoritarian strongman. Lithuania is ruled by these anti-liberal authoritarians, Augustinas Voldemaras and Antanas Smetona. The two of them in 1926 helped the military overthrow the country's left-wing government. And then also Poland's controlled by Józef Pilsudski, and the Vatican signs concordats with all of them.
Correct. The other curious thing to note, though, is that these leaders are fairly ideologically diverse. So the other thing that this whole moment indicates is that the Vatican is, in fact, willing to enter into agreements even with political leaders who don't necessarily resonate in all respects with the Catholic Church. The idea is that through these treaties, which are again recognized under international law, newly recognized under international law, through these treaties, the church is hoping that it will grow its influence within these societies, that it will be able to quash any sort of remaining anti-clerical sentiments and movements, and that it will prevent the future separation of church and state, which is the big fear it has about what sort of post-war order will emerge if it's controlled by the liberals and the socialists.
Does the Vatican want something different out of overwhelmingly Catholic countries like Poland and Lithuania and an overwhelmingly Lutheran country like Latvia?
Certainly. It does have its own hierarchy that is pretty explicit within internal papal documents regarding which of these countries it sees as most valuable and which ones it really wants to prop up as models before an international audience. So in Eastern Europe, Poland is supreme for the Pope. That is the key country that needs to have a clear, beneficial, strong agreement that binds Polishness to Catholicism in significant respects. In the case of non-Catholic majority powers, that concern is not as present. But what's curious too is that the treaties themselves are cookie cutter treaties. They look very similar from one context to the next. So the differences really come out in terms of how many papal diplomats are being sent on site, how frequently those papal diplomats are being asked to meet with elected officials and pose in public in photographs with elected officials, and how often Catholic newspapers are writing up stories about the newfound unity and harmony between the Polish ruling elite and the Vatican. So that's where you start seeing some of these differences, and the fact that absolutely the Vatican wants to have Poland be a shining example of what a Catholic nation can look like in Eastern Europe, and it wants Italy to be the shining example of what a Catholic nation can look like in Southern and Western Europe.
What did these East Central European leaders want out of the concordats?
These Central European leaders are interested in legitimacy. They have emerged from World War I with states, but those states exist on paper and not necessarily yet as objects to which residents owe any sort of natural allegiance. There's particular concern about borderland territories for two different reasons. One, because there are borderland communities that seem to be uninterested in these new national unification projects, and so they need to be brought into the fold in some way. And second, because despite the work of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, despite the work even of the Paris Peace Conference, some of these borders remain undefined before international law for years and years. So there is a question about what is the actual delimitation of this new nation state called Poland, for instance. What the Vatican can contribute to these sorts of debates and what the Vatican can do in this historical moment is offer a form of clarity. The way that the Vatican does that is by having diocesan borders coincide with the real or imagined borders of these new states. And so that boundary drawing work is actually helping bolster the sense that there is a there in the first place. The other thing that the Vatican can do is that it can intervene and make sure that the hierarchy within these countries is in fact loyal to the new country rather than to some neighboring country. And this becomes very relevant in border disputes across the region. So through this, shall we say, unmixing of clergy, it's able to create a clerical class that has some sort of allegiance to these new nationalistic projects. And therefore, the hope is, and often the reality is, from the pulpit and through official statements, the upper hierarchy will, in fact, send the message that the new country exists as a geographic unit and as a cultural, historical force. You know, this era is often narrated as one of the high moments of nationalism in Europe, and there's some sense in which that's true. European countries certainly use a lot of nationalistic imagery and language in order to get folks enthusiastic about World War I. Elites are talking the nationalist talk. But there's another sense in which that whole nationalism story is really inaccurate because it ignores the fact that many, many everyday people didn't necessarily strongly identify with a nation or much less a newly formed nation state. And so the project of nation building and state building is an ongoing one, which is to say the project of convincing people that they have so much in common that they, in fact, should all be united within one state form and presumably owe allegiance to the state leader. That's an idea that needs to be built up and elaborated in these years. So the Vatican, curiously enough, is also participating in that broader project.
The Vatican was helping to imagine communities, as the classic work on the subject would put it.
Exactly. Although that classic work on the subject says next to nothing on the Vatican, as you would expect, exactly because it's beholden to this older academic conception that essentially with modernization comes nationalism, comes the nation state, and religion fades away. And what I'm trying to show is that that is incorrect.
So we have this nationalism, the rise of nation states, and you write, quote, that the Vatican's diplomacy, quote, helped foreground a new comprehensive understanding of the international order, even as it consolidated the ideal and reality of the nation state, one people, one land, one culture, as a central component of that order. How did this nationalism, this new nation state nationalism, relate to this other phenomenon that's really important to your book of border crossing internationalism that really powerfully arose during the same period? Why did people become citizens of the world at the same time that they were becoming, for the first time, very narrowly construed as citizens of ethno-nationally defined nation states? Because they seem, if not contradictory, at least in tension.
One way into this question is to think about how, in some very important sense, internationalism and nationalism were co-constitutive phenomena. They didn't always or necessarily oppose one another. And in fact, the key figures who unified European nation states in the 19th century were internationalists. So you have socialist internationalists who built the nation. You have liberal internationalists who built the nation. And for these figures, there was no strong contradiction here in the sense that the nation was the space in which to translate some of your ideals into practice, but the vision was to create a community of interlinked nations that all similarly had translated certain ideological precepts into law and policy. So that's one bit of the answer. But the other bit of the answer is that the Russian Revolution and the founding of the Communist International does represent a very, very important global turning point. And part of that does have to do with ideas, which is to say, the fact that on paper, of course, we all know that this wouldn't end up being the case at all, but on paper, the Bolsheviks were committed to bolstering a global movement that would use the nation state only for a brief period of time as an intermediary towards this post-statist utopic future that they imagined. And that was radical. That was a radical attack on the idea that you could be an internationalist and a nationalist at the same time. With that proposal, essentially the Communist International, which got off the ground, in 1919. So it is essential to the Bolshevik project. Again, well before the Civil War is resolved, we have the constitution of this organization, which is about uniting workers of the world. And the Catholic Church sees this. Initially, it's not quite sure whether the Bolsheviks will have much staying power either, but it does find itself concerned by this alternative vision that's being laid out. And curiously, it becomes the kind of ultra-internationalist that bolsters the nation state, partly as a response to this threat of some sort of post-statist world in which workers of the world have united and thrown off their chains collectively.
Initially, though, you write that the Vatican tried out diplomacy with the Soviet Union. No, the church kind of erased that history. And you point to one very telling episode that both reveals the reality of this diplomatic effort and also how it was ultimately obscured by the way that the Vatican told its own history. When the Soviet Union invaded Poland in 1920, Achille Ratti, the future pope, who was then the nuncio in Poland, in Warsaw, was instructed to stay at his post, not to stand up to the Soviets, but rather to reach out to them in case the Soviets were victorious. And you write, quote, "Several years later, this episode would be repackaged and presented as proof of papal bravery in the face of international communism. The new hero narrative held that Ratti had decided to stay in Warsaw to invoke the protection of the Virgin Mary and encourage the resistance of the good people of Poland against the Red Army. Polish Catholic papers repeated the myth, affirming that Ratti remained looking at the wild horde of Muscovites, which approached the Polish capital with torches in their hands and menaced to annihilate our nation, faith, and civilization. But the new version of the story was far from the truth. The real motivation for Ratti's presence in Warsaw during the Red Army invasion was anything but anti-communist in spirit. Ratti stayed in the capital in order to strengthen ties with the Bolsheviks. Why did the Vatican, given its long-standing hostility to socialism, initially seek an accommodation with the Soviet Union? And why did that then change so dramatically?
You know, this really speaks to that earlier point I made about how the Vatican is willing to conclude treaties with political leaders who espouse a range of different ideologies. And that's because its chief prerogative in the years right after World War I is just to get as many of these treaties signed as it possibly can. It's on a fast-paced mission to get these treaties cranked out and agreed upon by state leaders. When it comes to state leaders espousing ideologies that the Vatican is not comfortable with, it wants to sign agreements with those folks too, because it sees these treaties, in that case, as hopefully acting as a check on what those political leaders will do. It hopes that these treaties will, for instance, bolster possibly a more pro-religious faction, or at least will diminish the power of the anti-clericals. And so that's very much how it operates with the Bolsheviks. It wants to conclude a treaty with them in order to get some protections for the Catholic Church on paper. There are a series of important historical contingencies that enable this illusion to flourish in the first place, too, which are relevant here. One of them is that initially the Bolsheviks go after the Orthodox Church rather than the Catholic Church.
And the Pope's sort of fine with that because the Catholic Church was repressed under the Tsar.
Absolutely, yeah. The Catholic Church was repressed under the Tsar, and it's okay with the Vatican if the Orthodox Church takes a little bit of a beating. We have various internal documents that celebrate this as a possibility for winning over new converts and basically occupying the space that the Orthodox Church once occupied. So there are these sorts of fantasies that are circulating around Vatican hallways. And then there's also the fantasy of curbing the worst impulses of communism, a phenomenon, a movement that the Vatican was well aware of. In the 19th century, they had actually condemned communism and the syllabus of errors. So it wasn't really the case that the Vatican was interested in any sort of ideological friendship here, but it was hoping that with a treaty of this sort, some of the Bolsheviks' anti-clerical impulses would get checked. The whole process of trying to negotiate this treaty, though, is a total failure. It's partly a failure because the Bolsheviks want radical democracy within the church, which the church is unwilling to deliver. It's not interested in having everyday Catholics elect the hierarchy, for instance, which was one of the demands the Bolsheviks made. But it's also a total failure from the Vatican side because the key diplomat who is ultimately assigned to negotiate with the Bolsheviks is a rabid anti-communist himself, and he doesn't agree with the Pope that this whole strategy makes any sense, and he is essentially working to undermine the possibility of an agreement pretty much from the get-go.
And this is Ratti, the future Pope.
And especially Pacelli, also the future Pope. Yes.
Yeah, it's really wild that these two figures under Benedict who are leading anti-communist emissaries of the Pope, who are much more hardcore anti-communist than even Benedict, later become the Pope, both of them.
Yes.
It's kind of unreal. You write that the roots of the Vatican's shift to hardcore anti-communism can in part be found in Bavaria, which, as we discussed before, was home to many conservative Catholics, including their Archbishop, Michael von Faulhaber, who described the Great War as a crusade and holy war against atheism, liberalism, and modernism. But Bavaria was also home to a very powerful radical left. In 1918, there was the first Bavarian Revolution, and then in 1919, a second revolution that led to the creation of the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which was part of this broader council communist movement. But that was short-lived. It was crushed by a military force made up of the German army and of right-wing paramilitaries like the Freikorps, who, of course, play a really nasty role shortly thereafter in German history as well. And it led to the summary execution of hundreds of leftists. And the papal ambassador to Bavaria at the time was Pacelli, the future pope, and he called the whole affair, quote, magnificent. Explain the politics of post-war Bavaria, that this fight between the right and the left there, and how it shaped both Catholic politics in Bavaria and also the Vatican's ultimate embrace of hardcore anti-communism. Because despite the Catholic Church's universalist, evangelist pretensions, what your book shows is that, especially during this period, not so much today, but during this time, the church had these very particular national commitments, particularly to Bavaria and Italy.
Papal diplomats had really a home in Bavaria. It was a part of the European continent in which they had numerous contacts and felt very much that this was a stronghold that they needed to hold on to. When Bavaria was swept by revolution, as was the rest of Germany after World War I, this was seen as an extremely dangerous development. Interestingly, the more moderate revolutionaries were seen as just as dangerous as the radical left ones. So there was, again, this general fear of a kind of democratic revolutionary impulse that was sweeping Europe, and in the papal mindset had as one of its leading aims the removal of religion from the public sphere. This was the big fear.
And at this point, they weren't really distinguishing so much between liberalism and socialism. They saw them as kind of twin evils.
They saw them very much as twin evils. And in fact, they had a genealogical story according to which socialism was born of liberalism. And so they were intimately, historically, and ideologically interlinked, according to not just papal diplomats, but many Catholics close to the Pope as well. So absolutely, that's very, very important as well. But whereas the response that the Catholic Church would craft to liberalism would be primarily legal and diplomatic in nature, the response that it would craft to socialism and then communism would really focus on growing youth organizations, growing after work adult organizations, and capturing new media in order to launch a cultural hegemonic crusade. And that whole vision was matured in part on the ground as papal diplomats like Pacelli were physically present in Bavaria through these waves of revolution, living in airtight informational communities. So, they weren't out talking to the liberal Democrats about how they felt regarding what was going on. They certainly weren't out talking to the socialists. They were in very narrowly defined informational communities where you have, really, when you read the sources, it kind of feels like plagiarism, the extent to which the views that come up in papal briefs sent back to Rome from Bavaria mimic, echo, repeat the views that are articulated in conservative Catholic journals in Bavaria and by the predominantly conservative Catholic hierarchy in Bavaria. And so the conception that these papal diplomats come to of the world battle at stake is matured earlier in Bavaria than it is elsewhere on the continent. In teeny tiny Bavaria, as you said, it's not as though this is huge part of the European continent. But if we were to draw a map of Europe from the papacy's point of view, or even of the world for that matter, if we were to try to draw a map of the papal imaginary in terms of the countries and locations and regions that really matter, Bavaria has outsized importance because of all of these long-standing ties, because of the vision of this as a Catholic stronghold. And so there is a sense in which, as goes Bavaria, so goes the world in papal headquarters. And that's part of why what begins as a minoritarian interpretation within the church, which is to say the interpretation of the chaos in the world as caused by the Russian Revolution and caused by international communism, that interpretation gets picked up in Rome more quickly as a result of the importance that Bavaria has in the papal imaginary.
That's fascinating. You're saying it's like this is where the Vatican learned on the ground, and there are other places too, and we're going to get into this, but this is one of the first places where it really learned how it would operate in an era of mass politics and street politics and internationalism.
That's exactly right. This is the place where the papacy starts using the media in new ways. It's a place where it really supports the creation of anti-communist civil society organizations. And it sees itself as responding to realities on the ground. It sees itself as a quick-moving, responsive entity that sees reality for what it is, has pulled back the veil, and has come up with a response, which is, in effect, to create a Catholic international that is seen as the counter, and in fact, as the only global counter to the Communist International. So the Catholic International is the response to the Comintern.
And Bavaria is also where we see this connection between anti-communism and anti-Semitism being forged. The first Bavarian Revolution was led by Kurt Eisner, a Jewish freelance journalist, and the Catholic right really framed him as this pernicious Jewish foreigner, this outside force that had entered the body politic. And the papal ambassador to Bavaria and future Pope Pacelli called the Bavarian Soviet Republic a, quote, harsh Russian Judaic revolutionary tyranny. And Pacelli was also, you write, obsessed with Jewish radicals' physiognomy. And this was this moment when the notion of Judeo-Bolshevism, which unfortunately is still with us today, when it really was taking root. And you write that it both conveyed that all Bolsheviks were Jews, but also vice versa, that, quote, what Bolshevism really was, and had always been all along, was a Jewish trick or ruse. According to this view, Jews were simply promoting Bolshevik-style revolution as a way to advance their true aims, the destruction of Christianity and the conquest of the world. On this view, Jews did not really care about communist principles at all. Communism was just a cover, in the same way that capitalism had supposedly been a cover for the advancement of naked Jewish interests. If capitalist control allowed Jews to make money, communist revolution allowed them to topple the existing order and seize power more quickly. This is what led promoters of this view to improbably claim that, say, the Rothschild family was not only amassing tremendous wealth for itself, but also funneling money into communist movements worldwide. Why did Judeo-Bolshevist conspiracism emerge when it did and function the way that it did? And how was it that Catholic anti-Semitism was there in the powerful way that it was, ready at hand to be used in the war on communism?
I am so glad that you brought this up, Dan. Thank you for raising this point. It speaks to a broader issue that I'm really hoping my book helps shed light on, which is exactly the centrality of the myth of Judeo-communism or Judeo-Bolshevism to understanding the 20th century, and what I might even call anti-communism as a cultural code. So there is a famous scholarly article that argues that anti-Semitism was a cultural code in the sense that it was well established as a way of speaking and thinking about the Jews and speaking and thinking about modernity and radicalism and capitalism long before the rise of Adolf Hitler. I would argue that that is correct, but we need to really focus more attention on the extent to which anti-communism also became a cultural code of its own and was interbraided with the pre-existing anti-Semitism, and in fact gave the pre-existing strands of anti-Semitism in European culture an extraordinary new life. Extraordinary in the worst possible sense of the term, of course, in the sense that this myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, which was drawing on texts like, older texts before the Russian Revolution, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, etc., various notions of a plot for Jewish global domination, drawing on those in order to simultaneously undermine the legitimacy of communism as a set of ideas and as a political force, and undermine the presence of Jews within the societies in which they were firmly rooted. So back to the internationalism-nationalism point, this is where Jews and communists were tarred as internationalists who necessarily subverted the nation. And that's where this narrative gets so toxic that we can understand one turn that it took later in the 1930s with legislation against the Jews, in the sense that as soon as you write certain peoples out of the nation, and sorry, I should add, legislation taken against the communists in the 1920s and 1930s and legislation that targets the Jews, specifically in the 1930s, is animated by a similar impulse, which is to write certain categories of people out of the possibility of being law-abiding citizens who are serving their nations.
And indeed, at this very same time, the Vatican is opposing minority protections for Jews in Poland.
Precisely. So I see these stories as really of a piece. This is the dark underbelly of the national self-determination story, which is often presented in bright, shiny colors as a moment when enslaved peoples are finally emancipated. The dark underbelly here is that in the process of national consolidation, you have the explosion of these myths, including, again, very prominently, the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism. And these myths hold that there are certain categories of people who are, by definition, anti-national and subversive and should be written out of the national community being forged. And I think that story, we're just at the beginning of telling it. You know, there's a terrific book by Paul Hannebrink on the history of the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism. I'm so glad that we have that as a reference out there now. But I think really there needs to be much, much more attention to what I'm calling anti-communism as a cultural code, and the idea that communists have no rightful space in the nation. This idea far precedes the Cold War, right? We often associate that with a Cold War idea. Far precedes the Cold War. And it was forged in these Civil War-like situations that erupted in the final years of World War I and continued up through the 1920s with what in most cases in Europe ended up being counter-revolutionary consolidations of power that had disturbing staying power.
The Vatican, time and again, and you detail this in your book, sided with reactionary forces in Europe in the name of anti-communism. And events in Italy, right outside the Vatican's front door, were unsurprisingly key. You write that from 1919 to 1920, Italy was hit by the Biennio Rosso, or Red Biennium, this huge series of strikes and protests. And factory owners and landowners in response funded the fascists, who offered what they described as this third position between liberalism and communism. But initially, the Vatican was wary of the Italian fascists because of their anti-clericalism. But then the fascists, you write, changed their approach, and the church, in turn, embraced the fascists. What was Italian fascism's initial approach to religion, or their initial approaches to religion? And given those initial differences, how did they eventually enter into such a close partnership?
Italian fascism was a really heterogeneous movement when it first started out. It was composed of a large number of war veterans who came home unhappy with how they were received and unhappy with the really pretty measly gains that Italy had won as a result of its work during World War I. Even though Italy was on the winning side, it didn't get many of the lands that it had been promised as a condition for entering the war. And a real nationalist fervor set in that sought to simultaneously delegitimize the ruling government as weak and as the reason for Italy's failure to get what it had been promised, and at the same time spawn a kind of paramilitary imperial project to regain or gain those lands in the first place. So what ended up consolidating as a movement known as the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, the Italian Fascis of Combat, in 1919, was a movement that was very much shaped by this immediate post-war context, strongly nationalistic, and responding to a wave of strikes that had swept both cities and the countryside. And these were revolutionary, exciting years for people on the left. These were the years of factory occupations, of worker self-management experiments, of farmers seizing land and attempting to put in place new notions of property that were no longer strictly wedded to a private property concept, etc. All of these developments were unsettling for a portion of Italian society. And initially, these Italian fasces of combat saw themselves as completing Italy's national unification through the claiming or reclaiming of land. And they saw themselves as peacemakers with, the bludgeon and the castor oil in hand, in the sense that what these fascist organizations were up to for their first few years of existence had to do with suppressing the left-wing activism that was visibly on the rise across the Italian peninsula.
Brutal and widespread street violence.
Brutal and widespread street violence through the torching of Socialist Party headquarters and newspaper headquarters, through the attack on peaceful demonstrators, and through the use of terroristic practices that were intended to scare people into obedience. These men were not all reading the same books. I mean, it wasn't really an intellectual movement. It was it was a bunch of thugs who were enamored with violence, who really saw violence as carrying out some sort of purification of Italy, and hoped to use violence both to grow Italy's national territory and suppress what they saw, again, as the leading anti-national forces within Italy. And much of this narrative was bolstered by the fact that the Italian Socialist Party, unlike the other major European socialist parties, declared neutrality during World War I.
So they were painted as treasonous by the right.
Precisely. So they were painted as treasonous by the right, and as anti-national, and as subverters of the national interest, and as the reason why Italy hadn't really received the gains that it deserved, etc.
Stabbed in the back.
Exactly. So the fascists initially were this. They were street thugs. There were also figures within this early fascist movement, including the figure who we now consider its leader, Benito Mussolini, who also styled themselves as intellectuals. Again, in the early phase, I would not tell you that this is primarily an intellectual movement, but there were figures who did their reading, and Mussolini believed that he could unite Italians under the myth of the nation, and initially, he was a fervent anti-clerical himself. He famously penned these racy anti-clerical novels in his youth. He saw the church as a challenge to Italian nationalism and Italian unification. But then, in 1921, Mussolini decides to create a political party out of this scattered band of thugs. Some of the thugs are very unhappy with this, by the way, because they are fundamentally committed to themselves as a movement that's critical of established political parties. So why would you go and turn around and become a political party yourself? They're not very happy with his decision. But anyway, he's able to bring along most people in this move that he makes in 1921 to turn fascism into a political party that will be different from all political parties that the world has ever seen. It will not fall into the corruptions of standard parliamentary democratic parties, etc., etc. And when Mussolini makes that move, that's when suddenly, lo and behold, his anti-clericalism disappears. And he gets elected as a deputy. And in Milan, which is where he enters into conversation with leaders of the church hierarchy, including this figure who just seems to crop up everywhere, Achille Ratti, who would become Pope Pius XI and was, for a brief period, Archbishop of Milan. And what Mussolini does is he promises that if the fascist party gets to power in Italy and becomes the majority party, it will be capable of restoring territorial sovereignty to the Pope, and it will be capable of restoring the church to its quote-unquote rightful place in Italian society. And this is music to the ears of the hierarchy. There had even been a Christian Democratic Party at this point, which one might think would have been the Pope's natural choice. But no, it turns out that the Christian Democrats in Italy were actually happy with the idea of separating church and state. They thought that would be better for both parties involved. And that was not a position that the Pope or
the Vatican
diplomats
disagreed.
Were happy with. So they don't have clear allies on the Italian political scene. When the fascists emerge, it's not clear whether they're going to stick around. They're a teeny tiny party, but they're interested. The church hierarchy is interested. And as the Secretary of State of the Vatican says right after the March on Rome, let's give these guys a shot. Let's wait and see before passing final judgment. Let's give these guys a shot. And what he means by that is let's give them a shot at delivering on what, from the Vatican's point of view, was the key promise, which is to say restoring territorial sovereignty and restoring power to the church in the public sphere. And as it turns out, in his own way, Mussolini does deliver on that promise. And in the years after the March on Rome of 1922, as the Fascist Party is gradually turning the country from a democracy to a dictatorship, a shift that happens from within, which should be a cautionary tale to all of us. As that shift from democracy to dictatorship is happening, he is throwing all kinds of bones to the church in the buildup to what would be the 1929 Lateran agreements, in which, as the Pope says, Italy is restored to God and God is restored to Italy, because an agreement has been signed between these two powers that had, for decades, been at each other's throats.
That's when Vatican City becomes the state that it is today and achieves territorial sovereignty.
Absolutely. That is when the Vatican gains 108 acres, which doesn't seem like anything. But if you see the behind-the-scenes negotiations, it was absolutely critical for papal diplomats to win territorial sovereignty back and have the sliver of land to call their own and to call a state once again. And so, again, in order for this power to feel as though it can pursue its internationalist aims, it sees itself as in dire need of a state, which is really fascinating in the sense that it's one of the most sui generis states around. But it has that same imperative that, so many nationalists had in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries.
And the Vatican is not naive about what's going on here. I think it's important to emphasize. You relate this crucial anecdote about this moment when fascist power was really consolidated in Italy. January 23rd, 1925, the fascists assassinate the socialist deputy, Giacomo Matteotti. Initially, that caused this backlash that benefited left-wing parties, including Gramsci's communists. But Mussolini seizes this crisis as an opportunity by taking ownership of the black shirt street violence and authorizing it as an extension of state violence. And this is when he has this infamous line, quote, "If fascism has been a criminal association, then I am the boss. And if all acts of violence have been the outcome of a certain historical, political, moral climate, then the responsibility is mine, for I created this climate. This totally chilling moment. And the Vatican's response was to gift Mussolini a copy of a book called Zionism and Catholicism, which argued that, quote, Judeo-Bolsheviks sought to destroy current society and dominate the world by themselves, as the Talmud prescribes.
It's chilling on multiple levels. One key takeaway here, I think, is that hegemony matters. Fascism won in Italy, and fascist movements start winning across Europe, not only because they successfully strategize themselves into power, not only because they wield the bludgeon, but also because they recognize that crucial insight that actually Gramsci was elaborating in these same years from prison, having been imprisoned by the fascists as the founder of the Italian Communist Party, which he helped found in 1921. And that is the idea that in order for you to rule and have legitimacy, you do need mass support. And in order to build that mass support, a key strategy is the pursuit of hegemony, which is to say, the creation of an informational system in which you provide an explanation of the existing political and cultural realities, and you are able to write yourself into the solution of what is presented as a crisis within that political and cultural moment that you're in. So the hegemonic project that the fascists pursue, which has an educational component, it has a civil society component through the creation of youth organizations and after-work organizations. It is self-consciously modeled on the parallel hegemonic strategies that the church has itself implemented. Even though there's certainly rivalry between fascism and Catholicism, and I wouldn't want to give listeners the wrong impression that these two marched hand in hand from the beginning. Even though there's certainly rivalry between fascism and Catholicism, at the same time, you have a convergence in the sorts of stories that these movements are telling their followers and the sorts of strategies that they're deploying in order to get that message across. And therefore, the deep polarization of the European continent and the monstrosity of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, to cite the most famous example, I think really can't be understood without taking a big step back and looking at the ways in which there's a right-wing hegemonic project that takes off in the 1920s, that has great explanatory power, and that has a hold on individuals because it is exactly meeting them at the grassroots level, through media, through education, through civil society organizations. And so I hope that one of the key takeaways that readers will get out of my book is the idea that hegemony matters. And of course, the implication is that hegemony doesn't only matter for the right, it matters for the left too, if we're going to have a chance at building an alternative here.
This is Sarah Jaffe, and you are listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, my favorite podcast for thoughtful discussions on the U.S. left and beyond, and you can support it on patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Bit Tyrants, The Political Economy of Silicon Valley by Rob Larson. For fans of corporate fairy tales, there are no shortage of official histories that celebrate the innovative genius of Steve Jobs. liberal commentators who fall over themselves to laud Bill Gates' selfless philanthropy, or politicians who tell us to listen to Mark Zuckerberg for advice on how to protect our democracy from foreign influence. In this highly unauthorized account of the Big Five's origins, Rob Larson sets the record straight. Those readers unwilling to smile and nod as every day we become more dependent on our phones and apps to do our chores, our jobs, and our socializing can take heart as Larson provides us with maps to all the shallow graves, skeleton-filled closets, and invective-laced emails that big tech left behind on its ascent to power. Larson's withering analysis will help readers crack the code of the economic dynamics that allowed these companies to become near monopolies very early on. And, with a little bit of luck, his calls for digital socialism might just inspire a viral movement for online revolution. Bit Tyrants: The Political Economy of Silicon Valley by Rob Larson. Out now from Haymarket Books. I think one thing that's important to emphasize is, because you made the important point that they were not, the Vatican and fascists did not always get along, but when they did have a problem with Italian fascists, and we'll speak about Germany more in a moment, it was narrowly on the issue of the Italian state encroaching upon church power. And Pius XI has this amazing quote: "Fascism declares itself to be Catholic. Well, there is one way, and one way alone, to be Catholic. Obey the church in its head." And then he also said, quote, "If there is a regime that is totalitarian in reality and according to the law, that is the regime of the church. Man belongs wholly to the church and must belong wholly to it, insofar as he is a creature of God. The church really has the right and duty to claim the totality of its power over individuals. Every man in his entirety belongs to the church, because in his entirety he belongs to God." To the extent that the church had real problems with fascism, was it really that it was because it thought the wrong force was totalitarian?
There were two main things that really bothered the church about fascism and that worried it about fascism. Number one was the idea that fascism had really as its end goal to prop itself up as an alternative religion for the Italian people and for the world. The idea of fascism as a political religion has a huge scholarly life, actually, in the years after World War II. So it's sort of funny to think about how those who invented that idea were, in fact, Catholics concerned about the displacement of traditional religion by quote unquote political religions like fascism. And specifically
the pagan worship of the state.
Precisely. Specifically, the worry was that the state was going to be erected as a substitute god, and that this was a form of paganism, as you just said, that would fundamentally undermine the institutional authority of the church and its theological claims. So that was worry number one about fascism. And the way the papacy interpreted this phenomenon was as a phenomenon that, in fact, contained individuals who sought to turn fascism into a political religion, but also that it contained individuals who sought to make peace with Catholicism and work with Catholicism in the pursuit of shared aims. So they saw themselves as bolstering the latter faction and diminishing the power of the former. And that was how they conceptualized a lot of what they did over the course of the 1920s and 1930s. Parenthetically, they had a similar conception about the Nazi movement ultimately in 1933. After some initial hesitations, they came down to a similar idea that there were two factions, one more friendly to Catholicism, one less friendly, and that it was important to work with the Nazis so as to strengthen the pro-Catholic faction. Close parentheses. So that was one sense in which the Vatican was concerned about fascism. The other sense was that it was concerned about fascism's real world presence and its hold over free time. It's the creation of fascist after-work and youth organizations in the later part of the 1920s was seen as worrisome by the church. And one of the key things that it repeatedly fought with the fascists over was when fascists attempted to limit the activities of Catholic youth organizations, of Catholic after-work organizations. So there was an ongoing battle for control over civil society. That said, it's important to emphasize that the only organizations that were legal in Italy, civil society organizations that were legal in Italy after 1929, were the Catholic ones or the fascist ones. So through the Lateran agreements, there was also the official kind of consensus over the need to recognize both of these and no other options, right? We are operating in conditions of strict dictatorship by this point. But even still within that framework, you had plenty of fascists who were eager to get rid of their rival Catholic youth organizations as they saw them. They saw them as rivals. And similarly, plenty of Catholics who were not happy with fascist organizations poaching their members and so forth. Similarly, there were disagreements in the realm of education and at this grassroots level in terms of what I see as fundamentally a hegemonic project. That said, there was ideological convergence on the imperative of first anti-socialism and anti-liberalism, and then also anti-communism. And there was also ideological convergence on the need to strengthen the nation state. The main difference was over what sort of meanings should be ascribed to that nation state and whether it should be erected into a semi-divinity or not.
It was a similar situation with the Nazis, who we should probably finally talk about, who believed in something called positive Christianity, which sought to unite Protestants and Catholics together against communism. And the church, of course, didn't like that sort of interdenominational solidarity, no matter how, regardless of how right-wing it was. But the moment, and you referred to this a few minutes back, the moment that the Catholic Church came around to the Nazis was precisely the moment when Hitler secured the Enabling Act in 1933, which is what finalized and formalized his total dictatorial powers. Because at that same time, he strategically walked back his support for positive Christianity. And so the German bishops responded to this moment, this horrible moment. They responded to it by lifting their ban on Catholics being Nazi party members. And you have this situation where you have a movement with a strong anti-clerical bent, but when you have something like the Reichstag fire, the German bishops are more concerned that it's a communist plot than it being a pretext for Hitler to tighten his grip on power, which, of course, what it was. How was it that the Vatican and Hitler ultimately came to an understanding? And was it as close an understanding as it was with fascist Italy?
The Catholic Church in Germany had been worried about Nazism as a movement, as, again, a minoritarian movement in the 1920s because of its anti-clericalism, because of what it saw as a form of paganism with its interest in the worship of the nation, as the narrative went. There was also a concern around the worship of the race and the centrality of race to Nazi thinking, again, primarily because that was seen as first step towards creating an alternative religion. There was also, as you mentioned, a great deal of concern around a later proposal to unite Catholics and Protestants under the anti-communist banner. And there's a colleague of mine, Udi Greenberg, who's writing brilliantly on this now in a larger history on the creation of interconfessional dialogue between Catholics and Protestants in Europe. And this is, one of those dark, curious, foundational moments for that dialogue. Again, not exactly where we initially think when we think about dialogue between the faiths, but it absolutely was that way.
Not so kumbaya.
No. And at this point in history, and in fact up through the 1960s with the Second Vatican Council, the Vatican would not be in favor of these sorts of instances of dialogue, even if they were concerning a shared enemy like the communist enemy. The relationship between Nazism and Catholicism was never as close as the relationship between Italian fascism and Catholicism. But there were certain similarities. One of them was the fact that the Vatican felt as though it would be able to split off the anti-clerical Nazis by entering into communication with the Nazi Party. The feeling was also that the Vatican needed to rush into a treaty agreement with Nazi Germany, which it did. There's some evidence that the Pope wasn't happy that his Secretary of State moved that so quickly to create this agreement, but ultimately, he signed on to it as well. And part of the animating logic there was likely to control that faction within the Nazi Party that was seen as pagan and dangerous. But what's striking is that as we get further into the 1930s, the Vatican, when it speaks out against Nazism, is really focusing again primarily on this worry that Nazism will spill over into a form of paganism. And in 1937, the papacy issues almost simultaneously 3 statements on doctrine known in papal speak as encyclicals. 2 of these deal with the communist menace. One of them deals with Nazism. The one on Nazism is primarily reprimanding Nazi Germany for failing to hold to the terms of the Concordat, or the Reichskonkordat of 1933, which it had signed with the church. The other 2 documents from 1937, these very, very important statements on doctrine, are presenting communism as completely beyond the pale, as representing global movement and a series of ideas that are antithetical at their core to Catholicism. And though, scholars have tried, one camp of scholars has tried very hard to rehabilitate the papacy by putting a lot of emphasis on its encyclical on Nazism in 1937, when you read the text, it's striking how meek and mild the text reads, particularly when you compare it to the other 2 texts that it was issued almost synchronously with, which are instead legitimizing and in fact calling for the expansion of a global crusade against communism, tellingly 1 year into the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, and I do want to talk briefly about Spain, but some more evidence on how deeply twisted Pius XII's approach to Nazi Germany was. He opposed the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939 because he thought that Hitler was backing off from anti-communism. And then when Nazi Germany broke that pact in 1941 and invaded Russia and the Baltic states, an invasion that was tellingly, Operation Barbarossa, was tellingly framed as a crusade against godless communism, very much the sort of language of the Vatican. But Pius XII did not endorse the invasion because he was still mad at Hitler for having signed the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, and the Pope told Nazi diplomats that the Vatican would support their Eastern Front war if they would only respect their treaty with the Church. That's wild.
Yeah, it is. I agree. And it also tells you quite a bit about how much the conceptual universe of these papal diplomats was fundamentally shaped by this immediate post-World War moment and the imperative of these treaties, which is why some folks told me, you should write 2 separate books, one on the papal use of international law and the other one on the papal anti-communist crusade. And my response to that was, no, these 2 stories are so fundamentally interrelated that they need to be told together. precisely because the notion of protecting these treaties once signed, because they will be, in the papal mindset, the way to guard against liberal, socialist, and communist secularization, that idea remains so central that it enables what, from our 21st century point of view, are extraordinary, irresponsible, terrifying diplomatic decisions that are made in back rooms. But again, in order to try to practice some sort of historical empathy, I would argue that what, from our point of view, seems 100% unconscionable was enabled by this early post-World War I moment in which papal diplomats see the defense and promotion of these treaties as the essential way to build Catholic nations and promote Catholic internationalism. And so without those treaties, they're nothing. That's their fear. And so that is why what seems to be a kind of irrelevant in the context of World War II and all of the atrocities going on, a kind of irrelevant insistence on the treaty and sticking to the terms of the treaty, sticking to the terms of the treaty and restoring the commitments of the treaty, etc. That's how we can understand this insistence, because to papal diplomats, giving up on the treaty is tantamount to opening the door to a liberal, socialist, communist new order, which is precisely the order that they had been militating against in the first place.
One major question I had reading your book is, it's very clear that the fascists across Europe and the Vatican shared a hardcore anti-communism. But to what extent did they also share a positive program? Because you write that the Great Depression had a huge impact on, obviously, politics everywhere and the Vatican's politics in particular. And the Pope saw the Great Depression as having been caused by liberal democracies and by economic liberalism. And the Pope, Pius XI, I believe, so he diagnosed the problem as economic liberalism and liberal democracy, but obviously also saw socialism and communism as products of economic liberalism and liberal democracy. And so he called for a corporatist economic order that was neither capitalist nor communist as the solution. How similar was the Vatican's diagnosis of the problem to the fascists' diagnosis of the problem, and how similar was their proposed solution?
That's one of Dan's famous $1 million questions. So, a few things to say on that. Social Catholicism, which is to say, the attempt on the part of the Catholic Church to formulate its own solution to the so-called social question so hotly debated in the 19th century, which pertained to workers, wages, capitalism. Already in the late 19th century, the Vatican is attempting to enter this conversation. So long before the rise of anything close to fascism. Already in the late 19th century, it is coming up with this third way solution that it's calling corporatist, which is a bizarre throwback to a very nostalgic vision of the Middle Ages, according to which corporations, which is to say essentially guilds, professional organizations, are the ones who are making peace between workers and bosses and are the ones ultimately making key economic decisions.
It was like semi-feudalist, is that fair?
It certainly was developed in a feudalist context, yes.
But they abstracted the guilds from the feudalist context. They weren't really interested in the kind of serf lord thing.
No, they were not calling for a return to feudalism. In fact, many of these late 19th century documents are still resonant. They're calling for a fair wage. They're calling for social justice, which is, by the way, a Catholic phrase. So there's a history.
The original SJWs.
The history here to that turn is precisely the attempt to come up with a third way that's neither liberal nor socialist. That's seen as in keeping with core Catholic teachings about treating one another justly. And it's, interestingly, a set of documents issued by the Pope, which would be picked up, as you might imagine, by Catholics on the far left and Catholics on the far right. Because almost like the Bible, which can be turned to mean various things and contains a high degree of ambiguity and a high degree of metaphorical language, etc., these 19th century texts laying out a Catholic corporatist vision for the economic order are silent on a number of important questions. So, for instance, they seem to suggest that there should be a hierarchy and that, in fact, there's something natural to a hierarchy which places bosses above workers. But there are other passages that seem to be suggesting more of a horizontal relationship as a possibility. These texts also contain a really strong articulation of a Catholic anti-capitalism, which would live a very long life. And the core of the Catholic critique that's laid out is the idea that capitalism is fundamentally individualistic and egoistic, and that it is undermining of solidaristic impulses that should instead be the ones nurtured so as to create a healthy human community. So these are all resonant ideas. The fascists, as they do with their Catholic youth organizations, as they do with their use of media, as they do with their broader hegemonic project, look to the church in the 1920s on this issue as well. And because they too had risen to power with the line that they were neither liberals nor socialists, and in fact that they were anti-liberals and anti-socialists, they present themselves as corporatists too. Now, because Catholic corporatism was a little bit fuzzy and hadn't actually been clearly implemented anywhere, Catholic university students decide to get together and organize a series of events in which they will openly discuss the extent to which fascist corporatism is in fact Catholic corporatism in practice. So they've read all the Catholic corporatist texts, they're interested in what the fascists have to say, and they want to stage a series of conversations on the very question that you just asked, or a version of it. The fascist regime does not like this idea at all and shuts down the meetings. So the conversations cannot take place precisely because the fascist regime doesn't want this debated. They want the public at large who has heard of Catholic corporatism, to hear the word corporatism and think that, oh, good, what the fascists are doing is what the Catholics have been telling us we should be doing since the late 19th century. So they're not interested in an open conversation. Alas, what happens through that intervention, initially it's the fascist secret police and then it's an order, etc. What happens through that intervention is that we don't have good sources that speak to exactly this key question. And instead, the sources we do have, which are, public statements issued by the Pope and by other clerics, continue to wallow in that ambiguous non-committal space where it seems that what's simultaneously being said is that we're glad about fascist corporatism, but the Catholic version is a little bit better. I'm not going to tell you why. So there isn't a clear document that I know of. Who knows? Maybe there will be something terrific that's discovered once the papers of Pope Pius XII are opened up starting in March of 2020. But to date, to my knowledge, we don't have clear evidence in the sources in the archives that really lay out this theoretical debate in very clear terms. And that's a shame, but that is a product of a particular historical moment in which this debate could have taken place, but it was silenced by the fascist regime for their own interest.
The most well-known part of the story that you tell it in a different way, is that Pope Pius XII was silent as Germany embarked on its campaign of genocide against Europe's Jews. And you note, for example, his reaction to the Allied bombing of Italy, which was a fiercely negative reaction. It shows that he was certainly capable of speaking out when he wanted to. And the Pope even pushed for the U.S., and I'd never heard of this before, for the U.S. and Britain to break with Russia and make peace with Germany so that Germany could wage its anti-communist crusade against Russia unimpeded. What did Pope Pius XII know about the Holocaust? And what was his response? And also, what have the conventional accounts of the Vatican's complicity, which have become pretty high profile in the last 2 decades, what have they missed? Because not only did the Vatican sit by and do essentially, we can round down to nothing, essentially nothing, as the Jews were slaughtered, but they also laid the ideological groundwork for that genocide.
So this is clearly a very, very dark episode in European history, although, of course, European and world history in the 19th and 20th century is full of similarly dark episodes in which certain categories of people, often in the colonies, are dehumanized to such an extent that their execution is not only presented as legitimate, but is presented as a historical necessity, which is precisely how the slaughter of the Jews ended up being presented. I will say that I'm willing to revise some of my arguments in the book depending on what, if anything, is discovered when Pope Pius XII's archives are opened up in March, although he famously destroyed much of his own archive, so we shall see what's actually there. But on the basis of what I have read and what I have been able to see, including documents that the Vatican itself published in a series of edited volumes in response to the charge that the papacy had done nothing and that scholars needed to see the truth. There was a carefully curated collection that emerged in the 1960s in response to that charge with some material from the archives. And from what I've seen there, we can see that the papacy initially didn't understand the extent of the massacre that was underway, but then it did gradually learn the broad outlines of what was taking place. And even still, it didn't clearly act. It didn't speak out. And the dominant reason that was offered at the time and since for that silence was the fear of retribution, and specifically the fear that fascist Italy would turn its wrath on the Catholic Church, and therefore that any sort of objection would backfire and damage the church directly. This is a very, very troubling narrative. And the other piece of it has to do with the fact that Pope Pius XI, in the final year of his life, had gotten a little bit more outspoken about the fascist regime and its grotesque violations of human rights, and had also articulated what by our light is not a very radical and in fact somewhat anti-Semitic, but anyway, he had articulated a kind of defense of the Jews and a kind of criticism of Italy's race laws. That started in 1938.
But it was never published.
That was never published. That was buried by his successor. So that moment where the church could have gone in a different direction is an important moment to recuperate. Because certainly all of the figures in this story are deeply religious and they are fundamentally committed to a series of precepts, including the sacredness of human life. All I can say on the basis of the sources that I've seen so far is that starting from the early 1940s, we have this extraordinary return of a double obsession. The obsession of protecting the treaties signed after World War I and the obsession of combating communism. And that dual obsession blinds the papacy to what is the real humanitarian story underway and what is the real human rights crisis underway. And the Vatican continues to cast itself as persecuted and beleaguered. And while it's certainly true that at a certain point in the 1930s, the Nazi regime stops honoring the Reichskonkordat, we're talking about a very different sort of order of magnitude when it comes to the crimes committed against European Jews and Roma and homosexuals versus the crimes committed against the Catholic Church. And so I see this as a real moral failing and as an instance of short-sightedness on the part of the church to not recognize the real human rights emergency. Let me just add one more quick thing, Dan.
Oh, yeah, please.
Which is that, sadly, the church didn't stand alone in this short-sightedness and its inability to recognize the extent of the crimes being committed during World War II and their nature. You know, what we today think of as the Holocaust and the extent to which today we associate World War II so much with the Holocaust was really only insight that was arrived at much later historically. Not until the 1960s can we really talk about the rise of Holocaust consciousness. And by the way, even that rise of Holocaust consciousness was enabled by all kinds of problematic things. So I wouldn't simply present it as a march from darkness to light. But anyway.
Like Zionism.
Exactly. And the founding of the State of Israel and the ways in which U.S. alliance systems shifted, etc. But there is something particularly troubling, of course, about a power whose own authority, in some fundamental sense, rests on a series of moral claims. There's something really troubling about that power displaying a moral failing of this magnitude.
And there's something very revealing about cowardice serving as a pretextual apologia to cover up what is actually a through line from around 1919 or so, when you have Pacelli calling the Bavarian Soviet Republic a, quote, harsh Russian Judaic revolutionary tyranny, to Pacelli becoming Pope Pius XII, who sits back after a long-running alliance with Nazi Germany and does nothing as Nazi Germany embarks on its murder of the Jews. So there's a lot in your book that we're not going to be able to get into, but I'd like to just talk briefly about the broader outlines of the Vatican after World War II, when it played a lead role in pushing for a Cold War against communism well before that war was launched. And it did that by working to undermine left political forces in Western Europe and backing Christian democratic parties, and it benefited from this surge in popular religious devotion after the war. And so, just in brief, how did the end of World War II reshape Vatican anti-communism? Or perhaps better put, in what ways did the end of the war fail to reshape Vatican anti-communism very much at all? Because we have Franco's fascist Spain, which is key to your story, but which we don't have time to really get into. We have fascist Spain held up before and after World War II as this model Catholic state.
Yeah, I think focusing on the Vatican's role after World War II and showing how it's not just that its religious politics shaped Europe in the lead up to World War II, but in the decades after as well, that also really proves this point that I'm trying to make in the book more broadly, which is that religious politics is not something far away and over there. It's a Western story too. Many have reflected on how strange it is and surprising it is that Christian democratic parties, apparently out of nothing, are able to claim control in country after country in Western Europe after World War II. And what I try to show is that the ground had been tilled for them by the papacy's pursuit of a particular form of religious politics that defined itself against communism and that basically mobilized an elaborate theological and ideological apparatus to fight communism from the Christian point of view. All of that gets picked up again by these Christian democratic parties after World War II. And interestingly, these Christian democratic parties also, the Vatican's interwar treaties, signed into law once again. And that's a key behind-the-scenes push that papal diplomats are making in their bid to shape the post-war order one more time. So just like they had after World War I, with the difference that now they have all the tools they need already. It's just a question of getting those treaties reconfirmed, and it's a question of making sure that the ruling parties understand that the fight against communism is the fight of the moment. So on all sorts of levels, the Vatican's influence is felt, whether it's because papal grassroots youth organizations and adult organizations play a critical role in get out the vote efforts, play a seminal role in drafting and distributing the propaganda that will help bring the Christian Democrats to power, travel around the countryside with mobile film units showing short videos that are promoting the Christian Democrats, create really flashy and sometimes sort of funny posters and comic books, etc. So the Vatican's expansion in the realm of civil society is very much relevant to our understanding of why Christian democracy wins, as is the ideological soil that has been tilled in the interwar years by the Catholic Church. And with this, we have the Vatican, which in 1944 issues its first cautious, conditional support for democracy. And many have hailed this 1944 sermon that Pope Pius XII delivers as the Church's definitive embrace of democracy, ignoring the text and the extent to which Pius XII, very much in keeping with the principles of his predecessors, is basically articulating a version of modernity on Catholic terms. And second of all, ignoring the fact that, as you just mentioned, the Catholic Church remains a staunch defender of Franco's Spain. And in fact, its defense of Franco's Spain, in addition to the key strategic role that Spain would play in the Cold War, enables Spain to move from being a pariah to being integrated within the Western Bloc, despite the fact that it was ruled by a dictator, Francisco Franco, who would stay in power until his death in 1975. So we are getting closer and closer to the present in a story that again shows that religious politics doesn't, at a certain point, disappear in a puff of smoke. And that, in fact, the forms of religious politics that get increasingly mobilized are ones that have been established in the interwar years in this anti-liberal, anti-communist movement that touch directly on issues like family politics, gender relations, marriage and divorce law, and then increasingly issues like contraception and abortion. And we would have a kind of early version of what develops in the United States, the kind of famous turn of the Republican Party towards these moral issues, we already can learn a lot about that sort of move by attending to this 20th century European story, which contains numerous echoes of a politics that's grounded in moral claims, of a politics that's grounded in the grassroots power that religion has in people's everyday lives, in the fact that local churches are providing services at low or no cost, most of the time at no cost, that are essential services for working people, and that this hegemonic work is in fact enabling the maturation of certain political sensibilities from a very early age, which would go on to directly inform how those once young individuals make their electoral decisions when democracy is restored in Europe after World War II. To most countries, again, barring Spain until much later, and Portugal and some other places too.
Well, Giuliana Chamedes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jan, for having me. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you for all the incredible work that you're doing with The Dig. I absolutely love this show, and I think it's playing a really crucial role in our political present right now. So thank you for staying so committed to it.
Oh man, that's so nice of you. Thank you. Giuliana Chamedes is a professor of European International History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the author of A 20th Century Crusade, the Vatican's Battle to Remake Christian Europe. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We are posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Julia Rock and Zachary Nin. Our senior advisor is Thea Riofrancos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio. And please do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. Also, if it's on iTunes or wherever, please leave us a nice review. Those reviews ostensibly help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is you just telling other people in real life, on social media, wherever, that you like the show. Please make propaganda for us. And do consider making a monthly contribution on patreon.com to help keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks a month is huge.